Hello, everyone. My name is Ben Wingfield, and I'm going to talk to you about the disproportionality of disciplinary actions with English learners in our secondary schools. Briefly, the reason why I chose this topic was because, as a person who works in law enforcement, the concept of discipline intrigued me a little bit. As an officer, I know that we relied heavily on the school to handle discipline when we encountered the students outside of school, because we like to defer it over to them and try to keep people out of sort of that school to prison pipeline system as an agency. So we rely heavily on our school system and our school resource officers to try to divert any sort of criminal actions from the legal system and back into the school system. So that's ultimately why I chose that. And then to add in the other interesting factor of English learners and the idea that English learners do receive higher discipline, I wanted to find out why that is and the situation involving that. So, briefly, I'm going to bring two situations to you. One, you have a middle schooler English learner who is constantly falling asleep in class at least once a day, every day, for the several weeks since the start of school. His response is indifferent to your concerns, and as you reach out, you find out the parents, one leaves early in the morning and the other one works late at night, and nobody really sees him get off for school. So, what do you do to address this situation? Next, you have a high school English learner accused of picking fights and making threats to other students. His parents want nothing to do with him as they're constantly getting into trouble. So, what do you do with him as a student? So, we're going to talk about discipline and what is discipline. Discipline is a corrective action used to change a behavior. So, do you try to remove a negative behavior or create a positive behavior? You use discipline in order to make that happen. So, do you want them to stop calling out in class, or you want them to come bring in their homework? You use discipline in order to make that happen. So there's two types of discipline. One being non-exclusionary, which is going to be your detention, your chores, your additional assignments like writing an essay as to why you are talking out in class. The other form of discipline is going to be the exclusionary type, which is going to be suspension, whether it be in school or out of school. In school suspension still removes them from the class, however, they still have to report to school. And out of school is going to be a detention that is where you are removed and have to be out for a while, and to the point that it gets to just outright expulsion and you are no longer invited to that school. The effects of discipline, the long-term effects for non-exclusionary discipline is little to none. So the idea of going to detention has no long-term effect on the student as just a minor inconvenience, so they will continue to conduct their education properly. However, exclusionary discipline, that can lead to poor grades because you're no longer in that class, so you are slowly falling behind all the other students. That can also lead to apathy as you've been removed from the system. So why should you try to keep up with your learning if that system has rejected and removed you from it? And then there's also self-esteem, as you are also been rejected. And is there something wrong with me, rather than actually looking at their own behavior? Because as a child, there's a lack of introspection sometime as to what's the root cause of an issue. So having them excluded could hurt self-esteem. So, English learners and discipline. So, according to exclusionary discipline from a state by state case, English learners on a national average are not disproportionately excluded from classes as everyone else. However, when you start to break it down state by state, it is learned that states like Hawaii, Alaska, California have a greater than average exclusion rate for their English learners versus West Virginia, Kentucky, and Mississippi, where your English learners are underrepresented in the amount of people who go through exclusionary discipline. I think you'd have to look at each individual state to try to determine what's causing this situation. So I could say that Hawaii, Alaska, California have a high population of Native American, Pacific Islanders that could potentially change some of the factors in that school system. And then with California, I was also thinking too, not only do you have a high Native American population, you also have a lot of immigrants coming from the South. And with Los Angeles, there's just studies to show that a higher percentage of minorities are involved in street gangs. California having a high Hispanic population on top of a high gang population, there is some overlap possibly that English learners are in gangs and they're getting disproportionately removed out of safety in the school system. Now, English learners are also disproportionately placed in special education programs. Some of this is just by poor screening aspects because of the language barrier and the language gap. They assume that there is some form of learning disability. And a study out of Florida also showed that English learners in special education are disproportionately separated, excluded, or put into reclusion rooms higher than any group of people for that area. Now, part of my thoughts on that is it because they are not challenged in the class, and that because they're not challenged in the class, they end up acting out because they're basically bored. Just because they don't necessarily understand the language of what's going on around them, they still can do the math equations and understand what's going on with that aspect of it, and they just basically get bored, zone out, and then act out of boredom. So why? What are the factors involved in this? I believe 3 factors to look at is going to be culture, bigotry, and poor training. So with culture, there's 2 aspects we want to look at. The foreign culture of that administrator or teacher in their verbal communication and nonverbal communication. So a teacher finds out that a student is misbehaving, they start to find out why, and basically we start getting into the subjective realm. If they're unable to properly articulate as to why they are misbehaving, then there is probably going to be a higher chance that they will be given a punishment. And because of their lack of the English language or the mastery of it, they may not be able to properly articulate why they did what they did. And also in nonverbal communication, if you are unfamiliar with different cultures, you may take their nonverbal communication as a sign of remorse or a sign of guilt. If they're staring too hard, is it because they are just unremorseful, or are they looking away too much as a sign of guilt? And in reality, the eye gestures and they're looking at the teacher is just a matter of their culture and not about the circumstances that they're involved in. So bigotry and poor training. So in realms of the bigotry, I don't necessarily mean racial bigotry, but in the sense that you are in my culture now, you have to conform to my rules, so you have a bias against that culture that doesn't allow for whatever the issue is going on, and that we have a system set up that doesn't take into account particular culture behaviors or actions. And if you just have this mindset that this is my home, my area, you're going to follow my rules as I say, then you could potentially have problems, and basically boils up to discipline that leads up to the exclusionary type. And then there's also poor training. So, for instance, failing to recognize if a student is actually requires special needs, if they're in the exceptional child program, are they disproportionately placed in that, and is that what's causing them to be disciplined because their failure to communicate and the teacher can't realize that? And is that fail to handle defiance, are they able to use their forms of verbal judo, as we call it in law enforcement, to handle what would be an unruly child? And because they become frustrated because they don't know how to handle the child, do they automatically resort to exclusionary discipline in order to, in essence, make the problem go away? So, what can we do? And the first thing is avoid exclusionary discipline, attempt to make more holistic approaches, and the use of teen court. So, exclusion. The problem with exclusion discipline is it puts the kids further behind. And that goes especially for English learners, as English learners are also trying to find their foothold in our culture and in our society. They're also trying to adapt to the language, and they're also trying to learn the course material. So setting them back further is going to end up creating a situation where they do poorer on standardized tests. And there's multiple studies to prove that when a person has been through exclusionary discipline, they score lower on the standardized tests that the state give out. Another aspect of the exclusionary discipline is it may be giving the child what they want, whether it be a non-English learner or an English learner. The child may want to be kicked out of school so they no longer have to deal with that aspect of their youth. If they get removed from the school, then they don't have to deal with the school, and they don't have to deal with that problem, and it kind of goes away, and they can sort of stay in their own world. And with that, it may create a cycle of failure that's a generational cycle of failure. So if that student gets excluded, but then over time, that student that was excluded has their own children, those children enter the school system. Then when you go to the parents for assistance and discipline, that former student may have that mindset of the school was no help for me, so therefore I'm not going to help the school when my child's going through it. And then eventually that leads to them being pulled out or excluded or removed from the school, and it continues this cycle. So one way is to also have a holistic approach to this. So I think for middle schoolers, this is a better angle, as we have to bring everyone in here that's a stakeholder. I say parents, but that can also refer to grandparents. That can also be important community people, aunts, uncle, anyone who's involved that can assist with the student. We also have to bring the student into this conversation too, as they are also an active participant in this education. And then the school, being that they're the ones to hand out the learning, they're also responsible for handing out the discipline, need to get up with the parents and the student to find out what we can do to avoid that, and to actually have a plan moving forward. Placing blame on what went wrong doesn't fix the issue. Acknowledging that there was a problem is fine. It's just you need to come up with a plan on how we get around it and address what's the failure. If the student's misbehaving, why are they misbehaving? And what can parents do? What can the school do? And what can the student do to make everything right? So then there's teen court. Teen court is a form of restorative justice that allows teens to basically have a say in what they did, why they did, but it makes them responsible for their actions. So you can't go through teen court without actually admitting you did something wrong. So in short, a teen will go before a jury of their peers and will explain why they did what they did, and will have to basically be doled out a punishment by their peers, which usually consists of some form of community service. Now, why I think this would also be good for English learners in the teen level is because it'll sit there and allow empathy to be developed by all parties. So a English learner that sits through teen court, and you obviously want to have a translator just so minor nuances doesn't get missed by the student when they sit in there. but they can hear how students of other cultures are basically just like them in the sense of getting into trouble and making stupid mistakes. And when they explain their situation before the teen court, those students that had to sit in pulpit is also required to sit in as the jury, and they now have to listen to the excuses created, but they also will listen to what's going on in the mindset of that English learner as they explain why they made their mistakes. Maybe there is that level of subjectivity that nobody really heard, and this is their chance to explain that and have other people to hear it. So one idea is situation one. We talked about the kid who fell asleep. So going back to that, that situation was actually a friend of mine when they were in middle school, and that person had seasonal allergies. And his parents weren't home, but he thought, oh, since I have allergies, I'm going to take this Benadryl before I go to school. And he did it every day, and to his surprise, he just kept falling asleep because he had no idea Benadryl makes you drowsy, because he didn't read labels, and his parents didn't know what he was taking. So when the teacher sat down with the parents, the principal, and him, they discussed what's going on and why he's constantly falling asleep. And that's when he explained, this is what my morning routine is, and that's when they found out he was taking the Benadryl. In situation number two, teen court would work well, as this person who's picking fights would have to explain to others why they're picking fights. And if there is a potential danger to other people, then maybe that person does actually need to be expelled, because in the end, we need to have discipline. Discipline in a school isn't just for the student themselves to also change behavior, but some of the exclusionary discipline is for the safety of other students too. Because we want everyone to be successful, and that there is no alienation, that everyone feels like they can come together. So that's why in that holistic approach, we want all stakeholders to be involved. So having gone through, and some other final thoughts that I sort of came through when trying to do this topic, I reached out to our school resource officer and basically asked him why he thought there was an issue, and his honest answer was he didn't think there was any disproportionality of English learners being punished any more than other group. And I asked if there's a possibility that there's a subjective element to it, in which he said that he believes that there is subjective element into all discipline, and that how a student responds to the teacher or the principal whenever they're brought before for discipline can sort of make or break the case of the student. So ultimately, I wonder, in these areas where there is high English learners that receive discipline, is there also a high level of gang activity? And you would need to do further studies to determine that, as Latino gangs are becoming more and more prominent, your SIR 13s, your MS 13s, and is that use of discipline to exclude them for the safety of other students? And that answer I couldn't find out. But I do think there is a certain level of cultural subjectivity that a lot of people don't realize that goes on, and that they're not using their cues. So the quote here: in the final analysis, there's no other solution to a person's problem but the day's honest work, the day's honest decision, the day's generous utterance, and the day's good deed. And what that means to me is that if we just work hard, we're honest about everything, and we're looking out for the well-being of others, I think we can have a successful outcome. We just have to be aware of other people's cultures and not necessarily judge nonverbal cues or the lack of good verbal skills as a means of guilt or not guilt or remorse or the lack of remorse. Thank you. Bye.